The rain turned the city lights into jagged smears of neon. Miguel and Sofia stood on the airport curb, the terminal doors hissing shut behind them. They had 2 suitcases between them and exactly $0 in their pockets. Miguel gripped his handle until his knuckles turned white, his eyes scanning the empty street for a bus that never came. They began the 3-mile walk. The rain soaked through their layers, turning the road into a slick, unforgiving path. Every step felt heavier than the last. They did not speak. The sound of their boots on the wet pavement filled the silence. They reached a low, windowless building on the edge of the industrial district. Miguel pushed the heavy door open, and they descended into the basement. The air inside tasted of stagnant water and earth. A single bulb flickered, struggling against the damp. There was no furniture, only a concrete floor that radiated a deep, biting cold. They set the suitcases down. The space felt less like a home and more like a locked box. They stood in the center, listening to the hum of the pipes, knowing they had reached the bottom. The sun did not bring relief, only the start of the next cycle. Miguel stood at a construction site by 5 in the morning, hauling steel beams that bit into his skin until his shoulders bled. Every lift was a calculation of muscle against gravity. Across the city, Sofia numbed by cold office floors, scrubbing industrial stains until the tile bit into her skin and her knees bruised. They were never in the room at the same time. The schedule was a lockstep rhythm. When he returned, she was already gone. They passed each other in the narrow hallway like ghosts. A brief brush of a shoulder or a muttered word, the only proof of their shared life. The apartment was always dark, the air stagnant with the smell of their combined fatigue. Miguel would drop his tools, his breath coming in ragged hitches, and collapse onto the floor. Sofia would return an hour later, her hands cracked and raw from the chemicals. They did not talk about the future. They did not talk about the past. They existed only to survive the next 12 hours, their bodies fraying under the relentless weight of the work. One night, the cycle stalled. Miguel stopped at a thrift store shelf on his way back from the site. He pulled a worn book from the dust, its spine cracked, and tucked it into his jacket. Back in the basement, the heater hummed a low mechanical drone that made the walls vibrate. He sat on the floor, the book open under the single flickering bulb. He began to read aloud. His voice was raspy from the dust of the construction site, but it held a steady, rhythmic cadence against the damp air. Sofia sat across from him, her hands resting on the concrete, listening. The words in the book cut through the stagnation of the room. Miguel stopped, looked at the empty space on the wall, and reached for a scrap of paper and a pencil. He pressed the lead down hard. He wrote 3 lines. Buy a home, start a business, become free. He slid the notebook toward Sofia. She took the pencil, circled the words, and placed the paper on the floor between them. The paper was thin and yellowed, but the ink looked permanent. They did not speak, but the room felt different. The intent was set. Years blurred into a cycle of overtime and cold leftovers. Their rusted sedan became a familiar enemy, stalling at every intersection, forcing them to push it to the curb while traffic honked in the rain. Every extra dollar they earned vanished into a locked metal box tucked beneath their mattress. They counted the coins by candlelight, adding to the pile until the box strained under the weight. Then came the afternoon at the bank. The manager slid a small, heavy object across the mahogany desk. Miguel took it, his fingers closed around the metal, the serrated edge biting into his palm. They drove to the property, the engine finally quiet. The house stood silent, a small structure against the gray sky. Sofia stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. She pulled the key from Miguel's hand and slid it into the mechanism. The tumblers clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound that echoed in the empty yard. She turned the lock. The door swung inward, revealing a space that belonged to no one but them. They stood together in the center of the living room, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and dust, finally hearing the silence of a place they had earned. The house was a home, but the garage was their future. They cleared out the cobwebs and stacked their supplies against the back wall, turning the damp space into a makeshift headquarters. Miguel dragged a heavy industrial buffer inside, his hands working the greasy gears until the motor hummed a clean, steady rhythm. He spent his nights hunched over broken machines, replacing worn belts and tightening loose screws until the tools felt like extensions of his own fingers. Sofia sat at a small, cluttered desk in the corner. She kept a ledger open, her pen scratching against the paper as she tracked every penny spent on supplies. Her eyes moved across the columns, catching every discrepancy, every wasted cent. They worked in tandem, separated by the hum of the machinery and the scratch of the ledger. There was no room for error. Every hour spent in that garage was calculated against their goal. They treated the business not as a hobby, but as a machine that had to run perfectly or not at all. The air in the garage grew thick with the scent of oil and paper, a testament to the hours they poured into the foundation of their service. The rhythm broke on a Tuesday. The phone on the workbench shrilled, cutting through the steady hum of the buffer. Sofia picked it up. She listened for 10 seconds, her expression hardening, then hung up without a word. Their primary client was gone. The contract that paid the mortgage, the electricity, and the food had been severed in a single sentence. Miguel stopped his work, the wrench slipping from his hand to clatter against the concrete. They walked into the house, the silence no longer feeling like ownership, but like a trap closing in. Sofia opened the ledger. She turned to the final page, her finger tracing the red ink where the numbers used to be. The shelves in the pantry were nearly bare, a line of empty cans rattling against the wood. They had bills stacked on the kitchen table, an impossible pile that grew heavier by the hour. The dream they had built in the garage was dissolving. If they could not replace that revenue by the end of the week, the bank would take the house. The reality of their vulnerability hit them in the chest. Colder than the basement apartment they had left years ago. Everything they had fought for was suddenly hanging by a fraying thread. Miguel did not look at the stack of bills again. He stood up, grabbed his clipboard, and walked out the front door. He did not wait for the sun to rise. He started with the neighbors, then moved to the next block, then the next. His legs moved on instinct. He hit the first porch, knocked, and waited. The owner shook his head. Miguel turned, walked to the next house, and knocked again. By noon, his feet burned against the pavement. He did not stop for water. He did not stop for shade. He approached every door with the same steady, unwavering rhythm. He pitched their service to a bakery, a mechanic, and a small office complex. Every no was a physical weight, but he pushed past it, his breathing becoming a jagged, rhythmic rasp. He ignored the cramps in his calves. He ignored the sweat stinging his eyes. He was a machine now, driven by the memory of the basement apartment and the fear of the empty pantry. He moved into the industrial district as the light began to fade. He was 12 hours into the walk, his muscles screaming for rest, but his hand kept rising to knock on the next door. He was not looking for luck. He was looking for a way out. The final house on the street remained dark until he pounded on the frame. A light flickered on inside. Miguel did not lean against the wall. He stood straight, the clipboard held out like a shield. The owner opened the door, looked at the exhausted man, and signed the paper. That was the 5th. The number echoed in his head, sharp and clear. He turned away, his legs heavy, and started the long trek back. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The sky began to bleed from black into a bruised purple. He reached their house just as the sun broke the horizon, spilling light across the porch. Sofia was waiting by the window. She saw his silhouette, the way he held the clipboard, and she knew before he reached the step. He walked inside, dropped the clipboard on the kitchen table, and slid the list of 5 new names toward her. The air in the room changed. The tension that had held them in a vice for 48 hours snapped. They did not speak. They did not celebrate with noise. They simply stood in the kitchen, watching the morning light hit the floor, knowing the house was theirs for another day. The collapse had been avoided. They had fought the tide and won. The survival mode ended, but the discipline remained. They stopped viewing money as a safety net and started using it as a tool. Every contract profit was diverted into assets. While others in their neighborhood upgraded their lives, Miguel and Sofia stayed in the same small home, driving the same rusted sedan. They applied the logic of compounding interest, buying stakes in businesses they understood and holding them for years. They treated every dollar like a soldier in a war, sending it out to work instead of spending it on comfort. Time became their greatest ally. The small, locked box under the bed grew into a portfolio that filled a folder, then a digital ledger. Years later, their daughter sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of stock certificates spread before her. She traced the lines of the documents, looked at her parents, and asked if they finally felt rich. Sofia did not answer. She reached into a drawer, pulled out a photograph of their first two suitcases from the airport, and slid it across the wood. Miguel opened his laptop. He tapped the keyboard, pulling up the final balance sheet. The screen displayed $1 million. The numbers sat there, cold and static, reflecting in the glass of the kitchen window. The $1 million figure remained on the screen, bright and precise. Their daughter looked from the display to her parents, expecting a celebration, a shout, or a change in their posture. Neither Miguel nor Sofia smiled. They did not look at the glowing digits. Instead, they looked at each other. Sofia reached out, taking Miguel's hand in hers. The skin on their palms was thick, marked by decades of friction, scars from steel beams, and the rough texture of 1,000 cleaning shifts. These were hands that had pulled them out of the basement, hands that had gripped each other in the dark when the money was gone, and the future was a blur. The digits on the laptop were just a record of time spent. The true value was not in the ledger or the bank. It was in the fact that they were still standing in the same room, still together, and still holding on. They had built this life brick by brick, but the foundation was never the business or the house. It was the grip they never loosened. They stood in the quiet of the kitchen, looking at their interlaced fingers, satisfied that they had reached the end of the climb without losing the only thing that truly mattered.